Hi, my name is Arthur Lozinski, and I am joined today with Mr. David Cappuccio. David has spent the last 45 years involved in all facets of the IT industry, from data center design and management to networking, applications, visualization, cloud, and edge strategies. He's held many roles at Gartner over the last 30 years, including VP of Research as a distinguished analyst. He's managed teams in application development, networking, knowledge management, infrastructure, data centers, and IT services. David was the creator and chairman of the Gartner Infrastructure Operations and Cloud Strategies Conference, as well as the DCIM category. Thank you for joining me today, David.
Thank you, Arthur. Pleasure to be here.
So, Dave, today, companies are having trouble getting all of their information, all of their technology metadata into one single repository. They talk about visibility a lot. You hear, we don't know what we have or where it is. Mm-hmm. What do companies need today in order to be looking at their technology in one single database?
I mean, in general, they need a single repository for everything. Call it an enterprise database, call it what you will. But it's not just, what physical hardware do I have and what are the licenses on that hardware. But it's all the metadata related to that technology. Or it's even metadata related to the users of that technology. It's lots of data. Enterprises today, it could be part of the CMDB, it could be Excel spreadsheets, it could be separate dedicated database for a specific tool. In most cases, it's all of the above. So what they really need is a way to consolidate that information into a central place. So it becomes much easier to use, much easier to extend, and frankly, much more auditable. Because the biggest problem companies have today is this idea that I've got a lot of data, but I'm not sure, I can't guarantee that it's all accurate. Because things are changing day by day, hour by hour, minute by minute. I've talked to companies who do literally hundreds of change orders a day. Do they know they're all accurate? It's catch as catch can. If I can automate or consolidate to a centralized repository, I should be able to create an environment that's much more controllable, much more auditable, and much more extensible as time goes on. So that's the direction we're heading in.
And a lot of companies today want a technology database where they have all that information. They're able to store the metadata. They're able to use the data that already exists in their enterprise. And they might be using, you mentioned a CMDB, they might be using spreadsheets. Maybe they're trying to fit it into their Workday asset management module. Mm-hmm. Why are those approaches not working?
They work for specific tasks. CMDB, if I'm deploying a new piece of equipment or a new laptop, I can use that as a mechanism to pull it out of the warehouse, get it allocated to a certain person, get software allocated to it. I can track it through its work order for that specific task. When you get into broader things, things like automation of onboarding processes. Suddenly I've got 5, 10, 15, 20 different tasks hitting different departments, different organizations, different types of data. All those tasks are run by individual vertical groups. And I need to get to a world where I can essentially run all those tasks from a single work order or a single process, all controlled from the same data. And if I have that centralized database of all that meta, whether it's HR or finance or IT or business units or wherever, I suddenly have an environment that's a lot more scalable, a lot more controllable, lots more secure, and are more auditable. There's a lot of benefits to doing it. Could I do it with a CMDB? Maybe if I really retrofitted that CMDB for my own specific needs. The question you got to ask yourself is that what it's designed for? And do I have the resources to make that happen? Not just to develop it, but to maintain it for the next 10 or 15, 20 years.
And just the development process can take quite a long time to try to retrofit
if you've got
the
the
data
skill
model.
sets.
The skill sets.
If those people stick around in 10 years. That's the biggest problem we have today in a lot of enterprises. We've got legacy applications which were designed really well back in the day, but the people who developed them are now gone. Documentation is not as good as it could be. In many cases, we're living with the past because we have no choice.
You're saying it's custom development.
Yeah, it's not a good thing.
What are the business outcomes of not having a functioning single technology database or a single repository of data and relying on spreadsheets or CMDB or dedicated modules?
It's it's more of the same. I mean, I know a lot of companies who run like that, and they've got a lot of processes which are automated and they really work really well. But they're very controlled by individual groups, individual silos. And I guess the business outcomes down the road is if those silos begin to break down at all, or if new processes come into play where those silos can't handle, you end up creating yet again another one. You end up with hundreds, if not thousands, of individual tasks that are automated. Managing that environment, managing those automations is a daunting task, and it's not easy to do. It's hard to scale an organization unless you keep hiring more people to do more automation. Most shops today don't have the skills, don't have the funding to do that. There's not people out there to hire to do that. So they're realizing that the way to solve the problem is not more of the same. It's less of the same, but more automation of overall tasks and processes. If I can start looking at let's call it top-down automation versus bottom-up automation. Suddenly I'm looking at end-to-end tasks or end-to-end processes and all the tasks associated with those. If I can automate that to a single process, and it's from a central repository, suddenly it takes less people to manage it, less people to control it, to audit it. It's a lot less impact on the operation itself, and it's a more stable environment. So I can guarantee that employee A is going to get the right workload, employee B is going to get the right workload, all following the same process, hitting the same buttons, the same controls, same levels of security. It's a much more manageable environment. When I talk to companies today who are called asking about this problem, they rarely call up and say, how do I solve my CMDB problem? Or how do I get an enterprise database? They call up saying, I don't have the people to do things as fast as I need to get them done. We're running like crazy. We're doing what the business wants, and we're responding on a dime that I like, but I can't, this is not scalable. It's just not sustainable. How do I solve the problem? And then it gets into a discussion about what are you automating? How are you automating? How much can you automate? Changes their thinking.
Onboarding.
Yeah.
That is a process that today is managed in multiple different silos. It's stitched together with tickets, which is really somebody doing something. How does that process affect the data that's in those silos, given that a lot of the work is manual and based on tickets?
Well, that's a key point, because some of the work is manual, and because the data in each of the processes is stored in a different location. The chance that that data is going to get corrupted or going to not be quite up to date grows exponentially as the number of processes happen. So there's a risk that down the road we're not going to know how much data is good, how much is not good. I mean, I've seen people do audits of compliance of endpoints. They hear about a zero-day attack that just happened somewhere, and they go, "Tell me what we've got, and what our risk is." And the first question they ask themselves is, "And can I trust the data we get from IT? Because do they really know?" Or if the IT does an audit, they realize we've got a lot of risk out there. And how fast can you make a change happen? Well, okay, we got to initiate all these new tickets, and they got to tie up. Just like suddenly there's 30, 40, 50 people involved with making this happen, and it's a daunting task, and it's a risky task. So I think what they're looking at is if I can automate these things and create a more centralized environment, can I reduce that risk, reduce that complexity, increase the efficiency of IT, and not have to worry about just bringing on more staff to do things manually like we always have. And eventually it's getting rid of the spreadsheets too. I mean, people joke about it, but we still manage a lot by spreadsheets, especially as you get farther and farther out towards that end customer.
The technology database is owned by IT. IT owns the technology in the enterprise.
Right.
How do the constituents of IT, or those that IT is serving internally, how are they benefiting from this independent technology database? Like, how is security, for instance, benefiting from having one single technology database? How is HR benefiting from having one single technology database? What are the benefits to the rest of the business, not just to IT, to be able to view, access, report on one single source of truth?
Interesting question, because if you talk to those individual stakeholders, HR, security, finance, they'll tell you there's no benefit. I could just do it myself. But all they're talking about is getting the data that they need. Mm-hmm. That's how we end up where we are today. Each one has their own database. But if you focus on it, what's the business benefit? Suddenly it's a whole different conversation. It's not necessarily just a benefit to IT or a benefit to HR. By consolidating things, the benefit to the business is consistency, consistent delivery of processes, a consistent level of audit, trust in that database, that source of truth, versus multiple ones. There's a whole bunch of side benefits. So it's an interesting conundrum you bring up, because from an IT point of view, if they're trying to standardize on an enterprise database, they've got to convince multiple constituents or build a business case. We're not doing this because it's a cool technology that IT wants. We're doing this because there's a fundamental benefit to the business. And if you look at it from that point of view, that top-down point of view, it's a whole different conversation. And I think that's how we've got to approach this. If we approach it as yet another Band-Aid that IT is bringing in to help out the business, I don't think it's going to work. There's a true business benefit to doing this, not just IT.
And so this technology database can be accessed by these various teams.
It's not an IT database anymore. It's an enterprise database. Yeah, it can be accessed. I mean, in fact, I would argue if HR accesses their own database today to do onboarding or offboarding, the metadata they get, it's stored in this enterprise database. They get it there instead. They just no longer have control of it. But as far as security of it and maintaining it and audit of it and everything else, that becomes it's more centralized control by IT. IT manages it, but IT doesn't own it.
So from the research that you've done, from the work you're doing today, what makes you think there's a need for a new category?
I think the way we're defining it, or the way enterprises that I've talked to are starting to define it, the traditional categories they have today, ITSM or ITAM or using CMDBs, essentially they're focused on the vertical structure they've had in the past. It's all about IT operations. This we're talking about something that's a lot broader. We talked about digital connector tools at Gartner, but those we're thinking that if you got all these different ITSM tools out there and they don't communicate with each other, that's causing part of the problem because they're silos. So maybe by creating these connector tools between them all, we can solve the problem. That became like a middleware way of solving the problem. What I'm thinking now is, talking to a lot of enterprises, is what they need is something that's a little broader than that. So it's this idea of let's call it a new category of let's call it enterprise database. I think it's important because it helps solve a lot of problems we've had for years within IT. We just haven't really talked about. The problems are this idea of greater and greater complexity, greater and greater scale, greater and greater difficulty in managing the existing environment. It continues to scale and it continues to get harder and harder to manage. I can't automate it unless I have that centralized repository. The CMDB is not solving the problem, because each independent entity has their own database. Is there a logical trend towards moving towards a centralized, managed enterprise database? Not necessarily an IT database, but a centralized managed database of metadata that IT can use as a mechanism to automate any process end to end. That's got some value, and I think creating a new category or moving towards a new category would make sense.
An enterprise-wide technology database
Right.
that the entire enterprise benefits from.
Yeah.
The database is part of it. The process is the next step. Automating those processes on top of the database is the ultimate goal. How much easier is that to do when you're working off one single source of truth?
It's a lot easier. When I could do it across 10 sources of truth, but I got to trust each one of those sources to be true. And I got to be able to audit each one of those sources and make sure that anything happens to any one of them, there's a cascade effect and everything else. So the more I can have a single source, I think the more successful I can be.
So the enterprise technology management space is starting to gain traction, and the enterprise technology database is becoming an important part of the enterprise. Of course, Oomnitza provides an enterprise technology management solution. It provides a technology database, and we're seeing a lot of companies having a lot of success by implementing this new technology. Why does every company need this technology, and why do they need it today?
Let me paraphrase Justin Trudeau. A couple of years ago, he did a speech in front of the World Economic Forum, and he said, technology today, the pace of change is faster than it's ever been, and as slow as it'll ever be. Meaning, something we all know, it keeps on getting faster. And enterprises today are living through that every day. The demands on the business, demands on IT, demands on new technology, new tools, it continues to grow. Business drives everything. IT needs to figure out some way to do that. How do you manage chaos in a world where I've limited staff, limited resources, limited funding? The only way to do it is to automate as much as possible and consolidate, get rid of any redundancies I can. I think an enterprise database, as we've talked about, can get them well along the road to solving that problem. Again, it's top-down automation versus bottom-up automation. It's automation of multiple tasks, consistent meta across the board. I mean, there's a whole series of benefits of doing that. It takes time to get there because IT is just used to doing things traditional, siloed way. But I think if we go towards this new idea of an enterprise database, there's a lot of inherent benefits to it, that not just to IT, but to the business itself.
David, thank you so much for spending time with us today. Thank you for sharing your insights. I know I enjoyed it. I'm sure our audience did too.
My pleasure.
And with that, thank you everybody for watching. Thank you for spending time with us today, and we'll see you again soon.